The okay, the issue we're talking about is branding. Welcome, Elaine. And we started last week. And I'll reiterate a bit of it just almost to catch me up to where we are. We were talking about branding, and we were talking about what it means in the business world. So remember that branding, it's a form of advertising, but it's a very specific notion of creating a distinct identity for a product or for a company. So it goes to things like the name, the logo, the mission, the values, and the tone that is set by a company. And we noted that Diana Butler Bass said it, but we didn't really need for her to say it. That is that a great many people, traditional religious labels now carry negative images. Even the word Christian is identified with its most narrow, restrictive, moralizing adherence. And so we've talked a bit about that. We've noted that it's an issue across all age groups, especially an issue for young people today who often see the church as well, mainly judgmental, which way too often it is. And many 20-somethings find this troubling, and they're put off by it. And so the church has a branding issue. But much of that problem has to do with what? With how much branding the church does. You know, that's the branding issue the church has, is it does a whole lot of branding, and people get a little annoyed. Now, yeah, that's going around now. It's going to John. Keep it moving. Last week, I let it stall somewhere out there, and we got to Aaron with 30 seconds to go. And John can't handle that. No, John writes copious notes, and they're eloquent, and they're actually embrace-worthy when they're done. But let's give them a chance to actually do that.
36 minutes, guys.
Thank you all. Thank you, John. So you have the okay. We don't have people online, which is a shame because they get to see my bald spot. And so that's the best. I remember years ago, 20 years ago, I think it was the Jenkins and the Goodmans and us were in Cape Cod one week, and Friday night there's a band concert in Chatham, and someone took pictures of it, and there's a picture of our group with this bald guy, you know, right in the foreground. And I tried to figure out who that was until I found out it was like me. I don't get that look of me very often, but these people are going to today. Okay, examples of branding that churches do. In what ways do churches brand? When we talk about churches branding and the frustration people have with the amount of branding churches do, what are we talking about? We mentioned one last week, that denominationalism is branding. You know, I mean, so we have 1,000 brands out there. Well, that's great for the message of Jesus. You know, I mean, so imagine the next person who's trying to figure out which brand. And how many are there supposed to be? I mean, there should be one brand, and then maybe, you know, you have some ways you all, well, we're this kind, okay, but Christian first, right? You know, you can go to any church and you can find Christ. That's the way it ought to be. And it, you know, in many cases, there's a lot of truth to that. But denominationalism, where your brand is first not Christ, it's something else. is a branding issue. We're good at that, Church of Christ. Yeah. We did better than a lot, but you see what I mean. I'm talking, and we can be as denominational as anybody. Aaron?
Well, I mean, I was gonna kind of break the question down, maybe two more parts, is that, are you talking about self-branding or outside branding?
Well, we're talking about outside now.
Okay, so
Branding is an issue across the board.
right, because a lot of churches get alienated by self-branding.
Go ahead.
What you were going into.
No, go
You know,
go ahead.
When they brand, in the name, if the first part of it isn't Christian, if it's a, fundamentalist or Bible believing or
Scientist.
that kind of Christianity says, well, okay, this is what we believe, this is our prima facie right here. This is our first priority.
Yeah. It might draw some and it might throw others
It
off.
will draw a certain kind of person. It will repel another kind of person.
Right.
But the Baptist church that I attended before here, the first part of theirs was, at least it was Bible believing. And that helped, but it was, independent, fundamental kind of, and I'm like, the more labels you put on yourself, the more people you're going to alienate.
Yeah.
The best thing I liked about you describing Churches of Christ is that they're like the 7-Eleven. They're kind of locally owned and operated.
Yeah.
Either there's no overseeing body, there's no Southern Baptist Convention, there's no Vatican, we don't have a governing body. Our governing body is sitting back there. There's a couple of them right there.
There are moments though when I would prefer to have one pope than 3,000. So it gets tricky. Sheldon?
I wonder if this whole idea of branding is part of human nature or fleshly nature, that be tribal, us versus them kind of mentality.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're gonna, that theme will keep coming back. In fact, I'll get ahead of myself there and say, this is one of the characteristics of unredeemed humanity.
Mhm.
Branding and hurtful branding. It's one of the characteristics of unredeemed humanity. I think Jesus came to stop it. But what we do is okay. We're going to keep coming back to that theme. It's a great insight. I mean, one of the big brands right now is in a whole lot of churches, gay people do not feel accepted. And even in churches where, well, sure, you're welcome to come, but it's very clear that there's some other kind of people. Well, that's branding. And that's a shame. The Muslims as terrorists would be a brand.
Yeah.
Branding Muslims. I mean, there's 1.3 billion Muslims or whatever, and there's a really small, measuring in the tens of thousands at the most, who are even supportive of terrorists. But when we think of Muslims, and the next thing is we think dangerous, that's branding. Liberal conservative is branding, on a particular issue. Well, they're liberal, they're progressive on that. Those people are conservative. And so this is all branding. It's not you can't escape it entirely, but it should be raised to consciousness, right? That's what I'm trying to do here. Is it should be raised to consciousness. So a text that we're going to keep coming back to is when Jesus says not to judge. And if you would turn to Matthew chapter 7. Verses 1 to 5. Do not judge, Sermon on the Mount, right? Matthew 5-7, chapter 7, well into the Sermon on the Mount, first 5 verses. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? Or you can put here. We've given up.
Okay, looks like you got a class going.
You got a class going. You hypocrites, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So what does that mean? You know, what does that mean? Do not judge. Now, when I was young in the church, I was taught to judge. You know, the church I grew up in taught me to judge.
Mhm.
You know, in fact, I thought the church's mission was to judge. Almost every religious comment I heard was judgment. And I'm exaggerating like this much, not much. Almost every religious comment I heard was judgment. Something was right or something was wrong. They were right or they were wrong. Everything was either right or wrong. Everybody was either right or wrong. So what did Jesus mean when he told us not to judge? How has this been generally understood in the past? When you hear that, when you remember Jesus said not to judge, what are you thinking? And you're not all going to be thinking the same thing. So it's not like you can get this terribly wrong. Okay,
Well,
Craig?
in the church, there's been a habit of saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. You've already judged when you say that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you're not accepting of that person.
Yeah. Yeah. Do not judge. What does it mean? One thing I eventually came to realize, but it wasn't in the church of my youth, but eventually I came to realize that probably I'm not supposed to make a whole lot of assumptions about eternal destiny. You know, that a person's going to hell or a person's going, you know, everyone who makes it to a funeral is going to heaven. Have you ever noticed that? While they're alive, a whole bunch of them are going to hell, but if they can make it to their funeral, they get in. That's the secret in Christianity. You know, you know what I mean there? I mean, we are terribly inconsistent. We don't even have a clue what we're talking about in most of this stuff. Okay, so Richard Hughes, in his book, Reviving the Ancient Faith, identifies what he calls a hard stop. That is a great book, incidentally. Richard Hughes, Reviving the Ancient Faith. If you want to understand Churches of Christ in a very knowledgeable, well-written, but very well-researched, well thought through, this scholar sees the implications of what we've done at various points. He's respectful of the tradition. He identifies with the tradition, but he doesn't let us off the hook when we went a little crazy. Richard Hughes identifies what he calls a hard style in our own Church of Christ heritage. It rose out of rough and tumble frontier society in Texas in the 1880s, and it speaks the language of the shootout. It's filled with gunfighter imagery, and it's always branding. Now catch what it does. It vilifies and demonizes those it disagrees with. Now, there's a way to disagree with a person without vilifying and demonizing, right?
Yeah.
But a standard way is to vilify and demonize. It assumes bad faith on the part of others. It's marked by deceit and dishonesty, quoting others out of context, mastering innuendo, feeding on malicious rumors, completely misrepresenting truth, making up stories to discredit the others. It seeks to silence all dissent and diversity. And he doesn't go on to say this, but that's essentially what Richard Hughes says. But what it's doing is spying on the freedom we have in Christ and seeking to make us slaves again. That's Galatians chapter 2, verse 4. And its practitioners are, simply put, again, this is me, ferocious wolves. You know, Jesus warns about it in the Sermon on the Mount too, and a few verses after this one. Now, who are the ferocious wolves? Well, I was taught pretty early on that whoever disagrees with me. But that's kind of weird words to come up with for just someone who disagrees with me. These are ferocious wolves. It's great symbolism: hunting, biting, seeking to devour, and disembowel. That's what a ferocious wolf is. And there are such people in the realm of religion in almost all areas. And of course, that is not just true of many in our heritage. That's who Richard Hughes is writing about. It's true of many churches, and here's that line, Sheldon. It's, well, certainly true of politics, right? Everything I'm talking about fits the political theme today in America, right?
Yeah.
In fact, it's true of humanity wherever it is unredeemed by the Spirit of Jesus. That's that. Now, I'm talking about a coming great global spiritual awakening. And we're not going to get there if we don't get past this. Is if you're trying to figure out the connection to the big scene here. But we've all outgrown this, right? Can you think of ways this is still done by folks who suppose they've outgrown the hard style?
By judging people who are to quote, put a brand on it, less spiritually mature than you are, in your opinion, because you don't know their spiritual maturity.
Yeah.
They just act in a way you don't want them to act. So they must be bad people.
No, I don't know. Just people do that.
I've heard.
You've heard
heard
that
it.
maybe some might do that. Yeah. Okay. Charles.
One of the ways that I think about how I internalize this early on, right? I didn't have language for it, the language that I have now. But this whole idea, when you're talking about the vilification of people that don't agree, it's a way of shaming, right? Because the way I always internalize it was it's not just that they had an opinion that was different, it's that they were bad people.
Yeah.
You know, it's a judgment on the person.
Yeah.
You know, not the idea.
Yeah.
And that is one of the things that I found to be so damaging.
Yeah.
You know, is that's very hard it's easier to change your mind about an opinion. It's much more difficult to change what you kind of think of yourself.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
those are two different things.
Yeah. And shaming is almost never constructive.
Well, and I can remember hearing, even when I would change my mind, or I would voice something different than what I was raised with, the response was never, "Oh, that's interesting, tell me more about it."
No.
The response was, "We're disappointed.
Yeah.
You know better than that."
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. There's the response you should have got, and that's the response we typically do get under those circumstances. Guy?
I find that when you develop the ability to put yourself in the person's shoes, tend to be less judgmental. Way back when I was in school, I remember it says professor gave it's he spoke of a driver coming down the hill in the truck, lost his brake. And he had two options, one to run into a crowd of 20 people, and the other with 3 people on the other side. So, and the driver, of course, killed those 20 people. So the question was, what do you guys think? So, well, not almost all the class said, no, he should have killed those 3 people. And what our opinion, we form opinion very strong that the driver was done, the driver was cruel. And now, professor said, now you are the driver. Now, those 3 people are your wife, your son, and your daughter. Would you still kill those 3 people? And you see how people are changing their opinion.
Yeah.
So when you develop the ability to put yourself in the person's shoes.
Yeah.
How they were brought up, or what their circumstances is, that helps you to be less judgmental.
Truly.
One of the things that just is so hard these days is there's just so many words, you know, and the words are just, they're, you know, I think, and I'm just gonna say this, diversity and equality and inclusion. You know, that just, you know, and you think, how could the word inclusion be ever a bad thing? But but at the same time too, you don't wanna throw these words around in a way that alienates other people. You know, so you're kind of like, you can't even speak.
Yeah.
What I feel like sometimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Scott?
I grew up in a time where the branding that we're talking about was mistaken for the immovable truth of the Spirit of God. And so what we did is we said that Christ is the same, you know, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And we attached that to some things that should not have been attached to. And so it seems like it's solid, it's a rock, and it's immovable. But it's also, and if I have an idea that's immovable and it's a rock, it's also something that's in my way. You know, and if you grow older with those things in your way, then you never make any progress.
Yeah. Okay, the ways in which this is still done by folks who suppose they've outgrown the hard style. I have to go to the area of politics and I'll just go draw on the last 30 some years or more in this church. It's happened a time or two, more than a few, but not all the time. Okay. And you can be in a discussion and you can say the most progressive idea theologically, and everybody goes, oh, that's great. Mention in a conversation that you think Jimmy Carter was a good president, and watch the scowls come over a handful of faces. Like, okay, and I'm not trying to make the argument for Jimmy Carter. I'm just saying, well, that's a political viewpoint. But you can see the heat that you would see in other churches on some argument with regard to baptism or instrumental music or whatever. You took the wrong side of the political divide. And you can just, you know, it's not like we've all come to wonderful, gracious equanimity about everything. Politics can, you know, and it can happen here sometimes. And just saying, okay, well, that person thinks Jimmy Carter is a great president. Well, they're not alone. A lot of people think that. And a lot of people think he was one of the worst. do we really need to get worked up here? Like, you know, what difference is that gonna make to us? Is Jimmy Carter gonna show up, you know? The Chris,
I think, you know, this is coming from the perspective of someone that's grown up in Whitney Avenue, was headed in the direction of being more liberal, being more accepting, and then coming here. But I think one of the biggest issues in today's day and age, at least, is we no longer have the ability to have discourse. We no longer have the ability to be involved in that coffee house culture of like, all right, I'm gonna say my point, you're gonna say your point, and have a little bit of a civil debate. You know, one of my best friends in college was probably the most a traditional Church of Christ person I had ever met. But he was able to have discourse with me, and we were really good friends, even though we didn't, most of the time we disagreed.
yeah.
And the reason is because I was able to listen to him, he was able to listen to me, and we were able to have that discourse. And I think that that's one of the biggest problems in today's day.
It's the ability to have a discourse. I mean, I think of Wendell Gunn. If you know Wendell Gunn and you know me, we're not exactly aligned on every political view, although most people would be surprised to find out what we are aligned on, you know. I mean, it's one of those things, but people notice what you're not aligned on quicker than they notice what you are aligned on. But the point is, Wendell could state something, or I could state something that the other one strongly disagreed with, and it would just be, well, exactly what I think Charles said. Well, I find that interesting. Tell me more about that. You know, and that can always be done, and move toward greater insight into why they say what they say, seek to understand, open that up, and eventually you may come to a place where now you can connect and work your way backward to a common viewpoint. But no, that's interesting. Tell me more about it. But having said that, at some risk this morning, I'm going to quote from a book I most recently read by a man named Rubel Shelley. If you have been in Church of Christ for a long time, Rubel Shelley grew up in the very conservative end of the Church of Christ, and then at a relatively young age in his ministry, reverted, I mean, changed radically, and became a powerful spokesman for grace and non-sectarian. He challenged us on being denominational. He did a lot of really good things. He wrote a book on divorce and remarriage, which was filled with good scriptural arguments for grace in that. This past summer, he decided to write 2 books on LGBTQ. And he works really, really hard. And I mean, I know him. If he walked in the room, we would go over and shake hands. I mean, I think we both have a fundamental respect for one another. But he works really hard to be loving. Okay. But we're talking about branding. And when we get to the conclusion of this book, this is what he says. If we take the Pauline language seriously enough, think of the gay texts, right? That's the issue here. If we take the Pauline language seriously enough that we regard it as spirit-guided instruction, persons who willingly engage in same-sex practices are thereby barred from the kingdom of God. Okay. Put another way, their choice to act out their sexual impulses with persons of the same sex is a choice not to live under God's reign and within God's revealed will. By that choice, they also forego the privilege of participating in the communion of believers who are the present expression of the kingdom of God. The church is forbidden to give its fellowship and approval to anyone involved in habitual or unrepentant behavior of whatever source. Just as the incestuous man in the Corinthian church was to be disciplined in apostolic authority, so much churches in our time and place exclude from their fellowship any brother or sister who is involved in blatant rebellion against biblical instruction, i.e., me. Branding. You know, at the end of a book in which he's really trying to come across reasonable and gracious, that's the last page. And if you wonder why my mood has suffered in the last 2 months, it's been reading some of this kind of stuff. And I've read it carefully. He's wrong on a dozen points, including his main ones. It's not, I don't want to spend the last few years of my life fighting this issue. But you have to deal with it sometimes. Point is, we haven't outgrown our hard style. Not across the board. This will still be okay. This will convince 80% of the churches of Christ right now. So there you go. Okay, a few more comments. We still live in an exceedingly judgmental society. For all the talk of tolerance, for all the alleged secularism and moral laxity in our society, public discourse from Fox News and MSNBC to talk radio is filled with what? It's filled with moralizing.
Yep.
It's filled with judgment. It's filled with finger pointing. It's filled with blaming, with slander and contempt, with labeling and polarizing, with moral busybodies, with this kind of fierce, alienating certainty in their eyes. So what did Jesus mean when he told us, do not judge? Now, how is it, question here, how is it that in a society where many people see traditional religion as judgmental, there is still so much moralizing and judgment? The churches are judgmental, but guess what? The non-churches are judgmental too. You can't blame the churches entirely for this. Yeah. Rosemary.
This was children's church lesson last week, and I didn't get past sawdust and plank, which I brought in. And that's literally is all I could do with the kids. It was just beyond their scope. And I think I was raised in the traditional Church of Christ, and I knew this passage. And so I thought long and hard about taking the plank out of my brother's eye with the speck when I had a plank in mine. But I think what people do, they take the speck out of their brother. They take the plank out of their brother's eye when they have a speck in their own. If you flip it around, you may be kind to a small judgmental, but if it's something really bad, the plank, you're gonna get it. I'm having a hard time articulating what I'm saying, but if you flip it around,
Yeah.
it's okay if it's a really bad plank, not
Yeah.
bad.
That's interesting. Do you want to tell me more about that? No. I see hands and it's probably going to get clarified in a moment. So Charles.
I think Scott wanted to say something.
Oh,
I was just gonna say, we were talking about don't judge. When I was young, it was, man, you can think it, just don't say it. That's exactly what it meant when I was growing up. I think don't
Yeah.
judge is hold in supremacy your relationship with other people. And that means being connected to them. You may not understand someone who's transgender, but if you, like me, were raised in a church from birth, you saw this child, precious and God-given to us, grow up to become someone that you don't understand, you still have that relationship.
Yeah.
And it means you trust the relationship. Even if you don't understand, you trust the relationship.
Yeah,
So whenever someone comes to me with some contentious judgment about an individual they don't understand, I say to them, be in relationship. That's where you start. You don't have the right to pass these judgments on someone you know nothing about. So get to know them.
Yeah.
And then we can have another conversation.
Yeah. Charles?
Yeah, I just want to say really quickly, in Matthew 7, this idea of when he says the measure you give will be the measure you get. This is one of those big spiritual laws.
It's a law.
Like gravity,
Gravity.
right? Whatever you dish out is what you're gonna get back. It may not be today or tomorrow, right? But if a person is disposed to judge,
Yeah,
right, that's what's gonna come back around. Right, this is a law that you find in many religions, right? Many spiritual paths have something like this, right? That talks about this way in which things work, that judgment is not free. You pay for it.
yeah,
You know, and by the same token, mercy, right? If you want mercy, be a merciful person.
Yeah.
Right, James says that.
yeah. We're blessed are the merciful.
And so this is this whole thing about judgment, I think we sometimes wonder, you know, why are so many, I'm just gonna say this, why are so many congregations dying and failing and falling off the map? Right, when it's full of crusty judgment.
Yeah.
What else would happen?
Yeah. It's toxic.
It's toxic and it kills itself like cancer.
Aaron, John, and now, then we have to,
Well, two quick points. One, the fact that all this is talking about, especially in politics, the word moderate. That used to be, it was popular to be a moderate in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
Which meant you were accepting of both sides' ideas. If you were a moderate Republican, you understood some of the left.
now you're a
Now it's
weakling.
dirty word. Yeah, it's considered a weakness. And a real life incident, a friend of mine's sister came out and she was in a relationship, she broke off communication. And I got to her and I asked why. She says, well, I was afraid when you found out that I was a lesbian, you wouldn't want to be with me, wouldn't want to hang around with me anymore or be near me. I says, it's not my job to judge your life. I got to keep my own life straight. And that actually formed a relationship again, because I mean, I had known her since she was like 13.
Yeah,
You know, and she just because of, I don't know, maybe because of the fact that I went to church regularly, she thought I was already judgmental.
yeah,
But that opened up a relationship.
yeah, it would. John?
Going back to branding in this context is a form of covert sorting, right? And going back to Aaron's original remark, it's designed to encourage people that we're not comfortable with to go elsewhere. And encourage people that do think they're the same to sort of gather around and be closer. And it's a shame because that's not God's design.
Right,
And God's design is exactly what Scott said. Get to know everybody, be part of a community. Don't worry about excluding. In fact, shame on you for excluding. But it is what it is. We just need to recognize for what it is.
okay, we're gonna come back to John on prayer in just a moment. I want to make a comment off of what Rosemary said. And I was joking when I said, that's interesting, tell me more. But there's something more complicated going on in that. It has to be factored into what we mean by do not judge. Because sometimes the timber that's in somebody's eye is a problem. You know, that is a real problem. Are we saying we let it all go? I'm just using your words for that. It just saying, I mean, Jesus' problem is that I have the log in my own eye. And boy, how am I even seeing the specks out there? But somehow I managed to see them. You know, but if you reverse that, is that, where does that quite go? And I don't know. I'm just saying that's part of our discussion as we move ahead. When Jesus says, "Do not judge," does that mean the utterly deplorable is like, oh, okay, not for me to say? You know, it is deplorable. Scott?
I think the answer is, in safety, we find the courage to address the worst of this. So, and if I'm safe in my relationship with.
Yes.
someone, we can both do the hard work. And it doesn't have anything to do with letting people walk around with plants in their eye. It's everything to do with being in a safe place to talk about the very worst of who I am.
Absolutely. Well put. Well put. John, if you'll lead us in prayer, please. We're going off recording.